Right, it is definitely a minute after the top of the hour. Thank you so much for making time on the summit right here on the second day of the amazing month of August 2023. Only 4 months left for us to be able to say bye-bye to this year 2023. Have you been achieving those targets that you had when you started this year? I'm not sure about that, but I know for a fact that we're going to have a very great conversation tonight, and the summit is in session. As always, my name is Eugene. And I'm not alone. I have my panelists right here. And of course, also joining us virtually is none other than Dr. Sarah. And we can be able to see the movements happening right here in studio. And it's very practical because this is live show. And Daktari Lonzen did insist he has conditions.
Home.
And because he's home on the summit, he can actually go to the kitchen and get. Oh, I see.
Imagine
President also wants some tea, eh? It's coming. Don't worry. Inakuja. All right. We have an amazing barrister actually here in-house.
In-house,
you order what you want.
But I was telling you he's my deputy.
He's no longer the president
His
of
term
the
ended.
Democratic Green
His
Party.
term
No, he wants to take over when the thing has already been
And
done.
now we are talking about coups. Is there a coup happening
We
right here on
already
the
had our Congress in May, and he was not there to come and campaign.
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, thank you so much for making time.
Yeah.
This is the summit. Like I said, we are here and we are live and direct. Of course, when we have this particular mix-up, you always know that it's going to be fireworks on the program. Like I said, I'm not alone. Let me bring in our panelists who are joining us on this particular conversation tonight. We have none other than Dr. Frank Habineza. I don't know if I should use this title, President, Democratic Green Party of Rwanda. Former.
Yeah.
You know, he's copying from Niger.
He's from Niger.
No, cool down, man. I'm still the president.
He should cool down. All right.
Yeah.
We also have Dr. Lonzen Rugira. He's the managing editor of the Pan-African Review.
And
thank you so much for joining us.
Incoming president.
And incoming president of the Democratic Green Party.
Yes.
You have come with a lot of energy and fire for this. All right. Also joining us virtually, we have none other than Dr. Sarah Virete. She's actually the chairperson of the East and Horn of Africa Election Observer Network, but also she manages the Center for Constitutional Governance in Uganda as the executive director. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, for joining us in Kampala or from Kampala, Uganda. Thank you for making time.
Thank you. It's an honor, and greetings to the gentlemen in the studio.
They have received. Another gentleman joining us all the way from South Africa is none other than Dr. Emmanuel Matambo. Dr. Emmanuel Matambo is a researcher in political science and international relations at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, Dr. Emmanuel, for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor. And greetings to the fellow panelists.
Right, perfect. We are going to delve in. And of course, tonight as we speak, the European Union, the African Union are actually escalating pressure on Niger coup leaders. Of course, West Africa has been experiencing a lot of waves of coups. And the question tonight is who or what is to blame for this? Of course, do they spell an end of democracy or to democracy? This is a question we'll also be asking right here on the program. Of course, it is the summit. And of course, like we always say, it is an engaging program, very interactive. All you need to do to be part of the conversation is join us. And of course, on our social media platforms, I don't know if I should say X or Twitter.
Both.
Tweet us or X us on X, and the hashtag to use as always is the Summit RW. You can also go on our live stream page, which is on YouTube, and just jump onto the chat section and leave a comment. Like you can see, Felix is there already leaving some comments right there. I want us to get down to business of the day, and of course, we are seeing some sort of return, if you may, of the coup d'etats around the continent with what we've seen lately in Niger. I want to start with you, Daktari Habineza. What is usually the root cause? If you read between the lines, what you've been able to see, sometimes those who actually do or perform these coups, they say we are tired of the way those who are in leadership positions are actually running the country, and so they want to bring back order. And the moment they go in, they overturn or do away, suspend the constitution, and they start afresh and all that. So let me read your thoughts. First of all, as a political leader, what do you think causes this? Is there justification for any coup whatsoever from a democratic perspective?
First of all, I would like to say that there is no justification whatsoever on coup d'etats. Because coup d'etats, they suspend the will of the people. So the will of the people is always reflected in elections. People campaign for the highest office in the country, and those who win, if the election is free and fair, they become the will of the people, because that's what the people have chosen. So if someone comes because he has a gun and wants to overturn the will of the people, there's no justification whatsoever. However, there are some other instances whereby someone may suspend the constitution. Someone has been elected and suspends the constitution, or suspends the judiciary, or becomes the country. Someone thinks it's the country. In that case, maybe the military can come in, but maybe after some other instances have taken place, like the Supreme Court have warned, the Supreme Court have warned that this is something going wrong, then maybe the military can come in to bring it in order. But we cannot give any justification to that. And I know for sure there's been a case before in Niger.
You're either hot or cold.
No, first of all, I'm against coup d'etats.
wants to have his cake and eat
And eat it.
Yeah, so make up your mind. Make up your mind.
First of all, I'm against coup d'etats. Because
under no circumstance.
Because they overturn the rule of the people. That's one. But if a leader is undemocratic or has been put there himself by undemocratic means, let's say he has come in by coup d'etat, then something can be done to put back the situation in order. But we should not still be happy with that. So in such instances, because I have a case in point with Niger, this is not the first time it has happened in Niger. There was a time in Niger, one president suspended the constitution, the Supreme Court, suspended the parliament, and all other institutions. He became the parliament, he became the judiciary, and he became the president. So at that time, the military came in to bring back order. So if you remember that case, not long ago, it was around 2009, 2010 there. At that, 2011. At that time, the international military did not condemn the military for doing that because the president had overturned everything. So they came in, and in a few months, they put in a capital government and returned back the country to democracy. So that was the only way. The only time it was kind of okay because they were bringing back order. But this time, there's no justification at all.
Dr. Lonzen, before we go to our guests who are joining us virtually, Dr. Habineza mentioned something called the will of the people. But the will of the people according to who? Let's probably just take some steps behind to be able to try and understand the definition of democracy. Who benchmarks? Who actually sets the rules? When we talk about democracy, when we even start saying that this is the will of the people, according to what? According to who? Okay.
First of all, I'll not allow Dr. Habineza to have his cake and eat it. So he says, under no circumstances should there be a coup d'etat, and then he gives circumstances under which it is acceptable. That is unacceptable. He has to make up his mind. Now, a coup d'etat, historically, in the post-colonial Africa, coup d'etats happened, we know, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And most of these coup d'etats were not internally driven. They were,
someone
external
orchestrated,
forces.
external forces, external hands.
So for me, in my view, those are undemocratic coups. The coups happening in West Africa today are democratic coups. And they are legitimate because the states that are operating in West Africa, and in fact this should be standard, when you have leadership that operates in such a way that it is determined, decisions are determined externally. There's a certain force that is pulling the strings in the state. In such a state, it is legitimate that anyone with the authority to remove such a leadership should remove them. And if the most organized and a force with the authority to do so just happens to be the military, but such a state that is run from external authority is in itself treasonous. So the removal of a treasonous state by military means is totally legitimate.
So that's your point on that particular area of legitimacy or illegitimacy. I want to bring in Dr. Sarah. Dr. Sarah, you're listening as the two gentlemen put their perspectives on circumstances, or under no circumstance should any coup d'etat be seen as a democratic or a good thing to happen. You actually lead, or as executive director, you're a leader at the Center for Constitutional Governance in Uganda. And you also lead the way when it comes to election observation. Talk to us a bit about who sets the rules when it comes to the definition of democracy, especially in the context of Africa, where we have had people who have said, maybe it is time for Africa to chart its own path on what democracy really means.
Thank you very much. And once again, I'm glad to be part of the summit show this evening. I think we should start by the basic definition of democracy. Democracy is defined simply as the rule for the people, by the people, the rule of the people, for the people, and by the people. So if we go by that definition, even the traditional systems in Africa had ways of making sure that the majority wishes of the people, values and aspirations are upheld. What differs from modern democracy is the system through which you determine or quantify the wishes, values, and aspirations of the people as who should govern them. If you go to traditional African democracy systems, I will use an example of chiefdoms.
Yeah.
Some chiefdoms existed in Uganda. I know some chiefdoms existed in Rwanda and so many other countries. All African traditional leadership was not necessarily hereditary. Where we had chiefdoms, there had to be consensus as to which clan should govern. So even in Uganda today, after the restoration of cultural institutions, recently some chiefdoms in Busoga have elected their new leaders. So it's not purely true that the concept of democracy is foreign, like some people put it. What changed is the manner. So if we go, for example, to the popular democracy in Africa, what are the ideal, values for democracy to thrive? You must have rule of law, you must have institutions, you must have, systems where everybody is treated equally and institutions govern, not the big man syndrome. But in the 60 decades of Africa's democracy, we have a repeat of the big man syndrome dominating on the continent. And that includes my country, Uganda, where you have, in Uganda, the biggest institution is the presidency. If you look at the way things happen, all the other institutions have really been deflated. And you have the presidency is larger than even a parliament, is larger than the judiciary.
Yeah.
So you cannot have the concept of the three arms of government functioning.
Yeah.
But when we go back to the African continent in general,
Yeah.
we have failed to build values and systems to promote democracy.
But values, but values, Dr. Sarah, values according to who? Who determines these values that you're talking about?
Yes, let me go to the wave of new constitutional making in the early 1990s in Africa. In the early 1990s, that's when the concept of the new breed of African leadership emerged. And most of the countries transitioned from the post-independence constitutions and enacted constitutions in a popular consultative manner. So if you say who determines the values, if you have a popularly enacted constitution which acts as a grand norm for propelling democracy, then you have the people determining their values, wishes, and how they wish to be governed. But the problem comes when some leaders are larger than constitutions. Ideally, if the grand norm was to govern, if a constitution gets in the way of anybody, it should be the other person to pave way. But the new emergence of the big men in Africa, the constitution paves way for them. And I will again use the example closer home in Uganda. If, for example, you have term limits and President Museveni should have retired, and that was the grand norm, Then President Museveni pushed the Grand Norm to lift term limits and keep himself in power. You have the Grand Norm saying age limit, you must retire. Then still again, the Constitution paved way for President Museveni to keep in power. So that's part of the distortion. And I am using that as an example. You can put any other country. We have the big men pushing the Grand Norm instead of them paving way where the Grand Norm blocks them. That's where our democracy has failed.
Right.
But partly on the history, a brief history of coups.
Yeah.
You know, since independence, we have had at least 200 coups in Africa. And half of these coups have been successful. In the last 1 year, since 2020, we have had 6 coups.
Yeah.
2022, 6 coups in 2022, 4 of them successful. And then we come to the situation of Niger now, and then Burkina Faso, the 2 coups, the failed coup in the Gambia and the Sao Tome. You know, the question is, why do people jubilate when coups happen like in Niger? You know, people on the street jubilating.
Interesting.
When
and that's why I want to bring in Dr. Emmanuel, because we've heard from the first 2 speakers right here in studio, Dr. Habineza saying that, you know, under no circumstance, coups are not, you know, justifiable. We've heard what Dr. Lonzen also said, and Dr. Sarah just now. Dr. Emmanuel, where you sit, I want to come in on that particular aspect. We have seen people throng the streets in cases where these coups have happened, and there's jubilation on the roads and everywhere else. Talk to me a bit about that phenomenon. How do you explain that, especially coming from a point where there are those who say that these coups are undemocratic?
Well, first of all, let's go back more than 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union dissolved, and then liberal democracy seemed to be on the ascent, and multi-party democracy seemed to be in vogue in Africa. And then in Africa, obviously, haphazardly, we tended to, just for the sake of impressing our donors, so to say, we adopted these systems for which I think with retrospect, we can safely say we were not really prepared to entrench on our continent. Because, I said so, the disillusion that we are seeing at the moment when people throng the streets to support coup d'etat, such as it happened, especially in the specific case of Burkina Faso, is that democracy, as we adopted it from the Western system, has proven to be a very big mirage, so to say. We thought as though with democracy, we are going to achieve the tangibles that the United States, for example, achieved after entrenching democracy, that the United Kingdom itself achieved after attaining democracy. Unfortunately, in Africa, that has not been the case, and it is because of 2 main reasons. The first reason is that if you look at the United States and the United Kingdom, the 2 paragons of democracy in inverted commas from which we borrow, they only became democracy in the strict sense of democracies maybe in the last 60 years, because up to the 1960s, blacks, for example, in America could not vote. So based on that, we cannot really say the United States was a democratic country. But then it had achieved, obviously, some measure of basic necessities for its people, and then it could now safely have the luxury to say, okay, now let us make sure that we institute some political rectitude.
Yeah.
On the African continent, that has not been the case. Africa has continued to be a desperately poor continent, and then to compound the situation, especially in West Africa now, has been the rise of Islamic insurgencies. This has been the case, especially in Burkina Faso, and in Mali, and Chad as well. We could add to that. Now, when people see that civilian governments do not attend to their basic needs, the basic need in this case being basic security, safety from Islamic insurgencies, then obviously people who have the mistaken hope that probably putting a soldier in power could give them more comfort, could give them more chances, could give them even a fighting probability of beating back Islamic insurgencies.
Right.
So as long as we do not get those basics right, we are not able to provide food for people, we're not able to secure people from the excesses of Islamic insurgency, then we should brace ourselves for more coups. We should brace ourselves for more support actually for coups that bring in soldiers with the obviously mistaken illusion that these soldiers will offer us a bulwark, so to say, against Islamic insurgencies. And then just to maybe let me just insert in one point there. When you look at coups as they have happened in Africa, especially in the last 2 years, we have to bear in mind that most of the times these soldiers act because of the groundswell of discontent and indignation from ordinary people who nakedly live and endure the insecurities that are brought up by Islamic insurgents. Unfortunately, though, when these military leaders are ensconced in power, they tend to become presidents, and then they tend to want to rule because now they have been ensconced in the corridors of power, and they do not want to relinquish power, or they do not want to foster a return to civilian government. That is where they get it wrong. But most of the times, these coups, especially in West Africa, have actually been happening because there has been a genuine and legitimate discontent and indignation by ordinary Africans.
Right. In under a minute, Dr. Emmanuel, to the big question of tonight, on our topic of discussion tonight, the return of coups. Is it a threat to democracy? Would you say it is, or would you say, nah, I think there's some justification, like you were trying to insinuate?
I will give an elliptical answer by saying what is democracy anyway in the context of Africa, but I will leave that to my learned colleagues to answer that. But then if we look at democracy, as Dr. Sarah mentioned it there, and then if you look at democracy as well as having periodic elections and having multi-party political contestation, then yes, we can safely say that democracy is indeed under threat. But then we have to put in that one caveat. Did democracy really ever have roots in Africa? Right.
I'll come back to Dr. Abineza here. And of course, I want to hear from your take, especially from what Dr. Sarah said, the big man syndrome, that is what she puts it as, especially when it comes to the aspect of the external arm that also Dr. Lonzen alluded to. For example, in Niger, we are seeing that the European Union has actually put in sanctions. They have pulled out, about $554 million in the budget that they had actually put to improve governance, education, and sustainable growth. France also is saying that they're pulling out their aid, approximately 120 million euros, about $130 million in the 2022 budget for Niger. At what point do you feel that external arm should be told enough is enough? You know, you can say what you want, you can do what you want, but this is our way as African countries, and we are going to have our way.
No, well, first of all, I would like to agree with Dr. Sarr on the issue of the big man syndrome. Yeah, you find that most of African leaders, they want to overstay in power, sometimes claiming that the people want them to stay, but when really it's not the people wanting them to stay, it's themselves who want to stay. So I've seen cases, and the recent case of the changing the constitution has been in Senegal, where a president who came into power, Macky Sall, had actually decampaigned the former president, Abdoulaye Wade, who had wanted to extend to a third term. I was lucky to be there at the same time when the elections was happening. And so he managed to say that Dr. Abdoulaye Wade should not take a third term, and he managed, and now he wanted a third term. So basically, this is the problem of African leaders, overstaying in power. So when you want to overstay in power beyond your mandate, things go wrong. That's one. So I agree with her that people, when they want to overstay in power, they start giving reasons, extending term limits, doing all that, and that brings problems. But back on the issue of Niger, let's talk about Burkina Faso a little bit, as Dr. Emmanuel was saying. Yeah. People jubilated when the democratic elected government was overthrown in Burkina Faso. They thought that the military could come in power, they would immediately finish up the problem of the Islamic State, bring back stability to the country. But we have already seen that it did not happen. actually the Islamists came inside the country and killed more people inside the country. So the attacks have continued up to now. So it's not a magic bullet that once the military takes over, problems will be solved, that security will be established. It's not the case. We are seeing that still happening in Mali. So basically, it's not true. It's an illusion that people think that when the military they take over, things will be solved. So it's not true. So what should be done is that military is part of the institutions of the state, should be strengthened. It's their job actually to bring security to the country. And we know the police also has a role to bring stability inside, and other security agencies and so on. So I think what everybody should do is strengthen that democratic elected government. If there's a president, those other institutions should support the presidents. So when you bring in about the European Union or the France or whatever, these are external forces which are coming in to help. They didn't come by force. The governments go and negotiate. We have our Minister of Finance here is always negotiating support, aid, even loans to bring to our country. So you cannot say that the Minister of Finance has been forced or government has been forced. They negotiate, they discuss some conditions and what, and they agree. Some loans are paid immediately, others are paid in long term. There's some percentage and so on. So, but they say some of it is donations and so on. They say if you don't have a democratic government, they're not sure that we will even be able to pay back, so they have to pull up their money. So I don't think that it's the issue of external aid. But I would like to agree with Dr. Lonzen. There's a problem of neo-colonialism, which I think has been a case in West Africa, where most of the West African states, they still have what they call CFA, the Central, is this West African?
CFA.
Yeah. CFA. Yeah. It's like a currency, but for all the West African countries, yeah. I think except for Ghana and Nigeria. Yeah. So these countries, they say, I'm not sure, but he will correct me, that the Central Bank of France is the one which has all the reserves. Yeah. So all the banks we have in West Africa, they don't have their money is deposited in France. Yeah. So basically, the economy is managed from a foreign country.
France gives them loans from their money.
So their money is sent it there. Yeah. So basically, they have one bank, big bank called BCAO, Bank of Central Africa. I think it's based in Burkina Faso or somewhere else. Yeah. So that big bank gets the money sent to what? To France. So like they are borrowing from their former colonial master. Now, this has been a big settlement. Yeah. People have even tried to say, enough is enough. Can we have our own national bank like other countries have? They have not achieved that. So there's been this big neo-colonialism tendency in West Africa that people are not happy with.
So in other words, you're trying to say there is justification.
Not justification. There are things that leaders should do to gain full independence. Right. So these countries gain the independence, but the leaders, they are not yet independent. And there's no issue of the military. So most of the military leaders we have in West Africa have been trained from French military schools. So there's a very good school in France, and I think like we have in the UK and in America. So most of these people have gone to French military schools. Now, there's also a breed of new military leaders who have gone to other schools, to Russia, to China, to America, who are no longer having the same tendency. Like people who went to French schools, they think that France is still, even though we are independent, but they are still our masters somehow. Yeah. So they still to tend to believe and to like accept the norm, like the presidents, and they go into this kind of, call it wheelbarrow, like a big van. Thinking that we are independent, but they are not independent. So I think this is part of the jubilation. People really want full independence.
People want full independence. Dr. Lonzen, and I want you to try and make sense or probe what Dr. Habineza just mentioned there when he started his point where he said that we have leaders who claim that it's the people who want them to stay in power, and then they create that big man syndrome. And for me, if the constitutions are about the people, by the people, for the people, at what point do you then know these are indeed the people who actually want me to stay, or actually this is just an illusion? It is just that person who wants to stay on. Yeah. And then according to who determines the term limits, and those limits, if it is not probably borrowed from somewhere else? Those are the things I want to understand tonight.
I want to know from Dr. Habineza, how long is overstaying?
Well, it's in the Constitution. People decide in the Constitution. Most of the constitutions have 2 term limits.
Constitutions are written by people.
Yes.
Tomorrow we can change it. And
yeah, so, but if you come in the middle of the game, like your term is ending, like the remaining 1 year, and you say, you know what, I think I'm so good, I need to stay. Then you're overstaying.
Yeah, let's say we are trying to craft something that is, you know, how many years would be good? Would be not overstaying? How many?
Well, people, the general rule is that okay, the common practice that a leader should have like 2 terms. Could either be 5 years. 2 terms
of how many years?
Either 5, either 4 or 7.
On what basis?
I think the maximum we have is like 7 years.
On what basis?
It's the people who decide under the democratic government. They choose their constitution. They put it there. So they said these 2 terms, either 7 or 5 or 4, are enough. So, but if you come to change that in the middle of the game, then you are mistaken.
I mean, is again playing around, you know.
I'm saying the truth.
I say how many years? He tells me 7, 5, 4, 3.
No, I've not said 3. I said, well, I gave 4. I think that's America. I give 5 now. That will be Rwanda. Next year elections will be 5. 7, I think there is a. No, Senegal has put to 7. So that's the range.
Yes. How did America arrive to 4? How did you know? What is the number? Where does this number come from?
That's actually what I want to understand. Who decides? Who decides?
Where does the number come from?
So if the people decide they want to extend it, where's the problem?
Again, and more question, moreover. If someone is poorly governing and they've been in power for 2 years, have they overstayed?
Well, no. If you have been elected
someone is poorly governing and they are destroying things, totally destructive, and they have been in
institutions in the press, like even in our constitution in Rwanda, we have institutions in the press that can check.
In other words, what you're saying is that it is the substance of their conduct, not the number of years.
No, those are 2 different things.
There's
the same poor governance, there's also the mandate you have.
Let's move the conversation forward. So, Dr. Lonzo, what are you trying to insinuate?
Okay. My point is what? Is when we talk about democracy, we talk about governing for the aspirations of the people. And there's the other side of the coin that people refuse to acknowledge in democracy. The one part of the coin is the governing within the aspirations of the people. The other part of the coin is the right of the people to overthrow you the moment you're not governing in their aspirations. So now we're having that situation emerge in West Africa, and that the national resources of these countries, even those European countries talk about, European Union, France, these people are running the uranium mines in these countries. So instead of trying to threaten to take away the aid, they should pay the market price for uranium. You know, they should not exploit the country's uranium. Take away the aid and pay the market price for uranium.
Or don't take the uranium at all.
Yeah, so that is nonsense. You know, this idea that we are going to take away because you made a coup. The purpose of the coup is that you are exploiting the country. And because you are exploiting the country, the leadership in place is treasonous. So whoever has the power to remove it should remove it. It just happened to be that these are people in the army who have the authority to remove that treasoners. So here, the people that should be condemned are the people who are giving away, people who are not managing the resources of Niger and the other countries that have been involved in coup. The root cause is the same: mismanagement of the national resources, and on behalf of a foreign power. That foreign power that claims to be supporting these countries by giving them aid. And the proper management of these resources is such that don't give the aid, just buy the resources on market prices, don't exploit. And therefore you have a legitimate government that will not be susceptible to being overthrown. And the moment you continue exploiting resources of these countries, you are triggering coups. And in fact, anyone with the power and the organizational capacity to remove such a leadership that is treasonous should remove it. And the group here to be condemned is not the coup plotters. It is the treasonous leaders that have been in power and using national resources for the interest of the foreign powers.
Right. And I want to bring in another element that actually is very interesting in this particular conversation. We've spoken a lot, actually, for the last 34 minutes about Africa and the coups in terms of the attempted coups. And Dr. Sarah even listed for us over the last 2 years or so the number of coups and attempted coups that we've seen. But we seem to be a bit silent on certain issues. For example, the 24 hours that shook Russia in late June this year, the uprising that was there. Some called it an attempted coup in Russia. And of course, we also know of what happened in January 6th, 2021 in the United States, the attack on Capitol Hill. And today, the former president is actually facing trial of an attempt to actually overthrow or take over or overturn the will of the people right there. Why the double standards, Dr. Sarah? We also know even when it comes to term limits, countries like Germany, we've seen even some monarchs are still there. People staying for as long as they can live. Why the double standards when it comes to Africa?
Well, the difference is in the three elements.
Go ahead.
The first element is an active citizenry.
Mm-hmm.
When a country has citizens who are civically and economically empowered, then they have capacity to check the excesses of their leaders. Mm-hmm. The second element is functional and independent institutions, efficient and independent. So when you see the checks on Trump's, Capitol Hill Treasonous Acts, checks by the Senate, checks by the Congress, and checks by the judiciary, including the judges he appointed himself, that are conservatives, they are sanctioning him. So the ability of institutions to withstand any misbehavior of a leader is what builds a democracy. The third element is the rule of law. Are we all equal before the law? And if you see how the law is being applied on Trump, it is an example that even, America's democracy has grown to the extent that they can contain a madman. There was talk of, giving Trump the nuclear codes during his campaign with Hillary Clinton. So even if a madman in the US has nuclear codes, the institutions and the empowerment of the citizens is enough to check that madness of a leader. When it comes to Russia and the acts of Wagner, in June, the mercenaries that are all over Africa who are hired, it shows that also, because of course you cannot call Russia a democracy, you cannot. It's only a superpower because it has accumulated, some amount of economic muscle, and it can compete and threaten, the big five superpowers in the world. But I don't think you can mistake Russia to be a democracy. You cannot. When it comes to France or absence of term limits, let me use an example of Tony Blair in Britain. Yeah. When Tony Blair won the third term, I think he was the second longest serving prime minister next to Margaret Thatcher. Yes. He could not even spend a year. And that shows you that when you have the three elements of rule of law, of empowered and active citizenry, and functional institutions, then you do not need term limits. The institutions and the people checked Tony Blair, even when he won an election. He had to step down internally to Gordon Brown. He could not go on. So we needed to develop the three elements because they are the tested elements that can protect and propel democracy in our countries.
Interesting perspective. Dr. Emmanuel, what do you say? Is it a question of inferiority complex? Africans, we feel they are okay, they can do what they want, but when it comes to us, are we applying double standards? I did not see African Union, for example, condemn what happened in Russia. I didn't see anyone condemn the statements or threatening to pull any resources or any kind of support when we saw the incidents at Capitol Hill. Why would it always be about Africa when it happens back here? What say you, Dr. Emmanuel?
I think let us just look at the realities of Africa's fragile democracies. What happened, by the way, on January 6, 2021 was really a sobering reminder to the United States because for a long time it saw itself as an impregnable democracy. But then that just showed that even when it comes to matters of political sanctity, even the United States itself is a human institution, an institution that can be threatened anytime. So that was quite a sobering moment for the United States. Now, when it comes to Africa, I wouldn't really, by the way, before I go into the substance of my answer, let me just say we should not make an idol out of term limits we should not have a fetish for how many years a person should stay in power. I think if people have put you in power, they should retain the right to rise against you at any time. Unfortunately, obviously, that sometimes the military tends to usurp that particular power of the people. But I think ultimately the power is really embedded in the people, and they should and they can rise against any leader, even if you're a month into office. When it comes to Africa and whether or not the spotlight is unfairly on Africa and whether or not there are double standards explained here, it is because we should know that as Africans will always be outsiders when it comes to issues of the notions of democracy, because we are adopting a system that was not really strictly African. Now, I may draw a substantial difference here between democracy as we adopted it from the West and accountable governance. When Dr. Sarah talked about chiefdoms and how they're elected, she was talking about accountable governance, and I think that is of utmost importance, and that is actually embedded in African tradition. When it comes to democracy as we adopted it from the West, it is a bastardized form of imposition, Western imposition on what African politics should look like. Why do we attract the spotlight so much to the detriment of our own reputation in the community of nations? Well, we do that because when we have bad governance in Africa, when we have coups in Africa, the consequences are more dire than they would be. Imagine if what happened on January 6th happened in Africa, where we have weak institutions, for example, where our democracy is still embryonic, where our economy is still fragile, for example. How many people would have taken advantage of that particular situation there to actually mount an assault on government institutions and seize power? So the consequences are usually dire in Africa because we have weak institutions, we have an economic system that is desperately susceptible to the whims of other foreign powers. I think that is why we incur the attention that we do. This manifests itself, by the way, on a range of subjects. It is not only on the subject of coups and democracy, it is even in terms of corruption. When you look at the corruption that we do here in Africa and the corruption that happens in the United States, what we have here in Africa is actually pocket change. But then the consequences are more dire in Africa because of the weak stature of our economies. So we attract that unwarranted attention because of our just weak circumstances, not because there is an unfair light that has been spotlighted on our continent.
Interesting. In just a while, I'll be welcoming comments, and you can be able to tweet if you have any feedback from the statements you've been hearing from our panelists right here tonight on the summit. All you need to do is tweet us or X us, and the hashtag to use as always is the Summit RW. I'll be able to read your thoughts. Also, leave a comment on our live stream right about now on YouTube. You can go on the chat section. I'll be able to read your feedback. Just keep them coming thick and fast. Dr. Habinez, I want to pick up from what Dr. Emmanuel just mentioned. If people put you in power, they can also have the right and the mandate to remove you when they want. Yeah. And the question now is, because you are the one who mentioned that, also Dr. Sarah, that why we see most of the politicians stay on is because it's not the people who want them to stay. Why is it that it is unfair? If they can remove you, can they also let you stay on?
Yeah, I mean, if the
without it looking like a problem, especially when it comes to the borrowed so-called democracy, because if other countries or other nations are saying that democracy is supposed to be about election in and election out, does it stop at that?
Well, first of all, if you are a democratically elected leader, that means you have been put there by the people. You have gone to an elections and people have chosen you. So in the Constitution, it's written there. Because democracy, as they said, and as we all know, it's the rule of the people, for the people, by the people. So in the Constitution, it's written, if the leader is not performing well, there are institutions to check. Even the Rwandan Constitution will have it. The Parliament has an obligation to check, I think, the Senate, and even the President, if he is malfunctioning or does something wrong, the Supreme Court can try him, even when he's still in office. So it is written there. So the institutions, if they are enforced or they are working well, they have the capacity to remove remove you if you have done something wrong, if you're not functioning well. But it's not the role of the military to come and take you over because you have been put by the people. The people can remove you through the democratic institutions or the institutions that's there. If the military now comes in to remove an elected leader, that is wrong. That is illegal. That is catastrophe. It should not be accepted. It should not be tolerated. Full stop. I would like to quote a book or to talk about a book which I think you all know. Dr. Rosen must know it. It's by Paul Courier. It's called Wars, Guns and Votes, that democracy in dangerous places. In that book by Paul Courier, he mentions that where actually has given good examples. He talked about a little bit about Rwanda, about Uganda, Nigeria, and so many other countries, mostly in West Africa. He says that where coups happen, there's a tendency that they will happen again and again and again. So basically, it's not a solution. If you make a coup d'etat, you attempt one coup d'etat in this country, they will happen again. So it does not breed democracy, it does not help democracy at all. If you try to solve your problems through democratic means, because if you use a coup d'etat, another soldier will come. This is now last time it was a colonel, I think, a captain. The colonel will come, and then today in Nigeria it's a general. Sometimes be a major, whatever. So basically, the soldiers they will just think that if someone is not functioning well, the soldiers will keep on. So they will think it's a norm. So basically, we need to build our institutions. We can remove these leaders if they're not functioning well through democratic institutions, and let's build that. Then we can give examples, be like a good other countries elsewhere in the world.
Right. And Dr. Lonzen, if we move this conversation forward and now talk about conflict resolution, are there better ways? Let's talk a bit about that. Especially in the case of Kenya, for instance.
But I have to come back.
Of course, you'll definitely come back to it. But I want to ask this question because it's very important. We have seen when elections have been done, and a perfect example of the rise of coalition governments, where you have a government of national unity, where the loser is told, you know what, fine, let us share power so that we can have peace. What does that say even to those who feel, I was democratically elected through the electoral processes? Why is this loser coming to want to eat my chapati or take it off from my mouth? Let's talk a bit about the power of this conflict resolution and whether they can be also summed as part of democratic processes that we see in the continent.
Yeah, so I have to return to Inez and then I'll come back to you.
Yes, yes.
As a leader who, okay, in Survey Africa, are the leaders in place elected and they're there because of the will of the people?
Some are there by the will of the people.
Approximately, say what percentage is there?
Well, I've not connected the census to know which countries. But we know for sure that there are some leaders.
54 countries.
If you check some countries, I will not mention their names because of diplomacy issues and so on. But there are some leaders who have been in some African countries for over 30 years, 40 years.
I'm not talking about the years. I'm not talking about the years.
So if that happens, I'm not going to mention the countries. You will find out that people have wanted these leaders to go, but they have not managed to make them go. So that has happened. But there are also other many countries, which I'm not also going to mention names, where our leaders have been elected democratically. So it's there. We have half-half.
Yes. So if we have a situation where maybe 5 leaders on the African continent out of 54, more than 90%, they are there and they've gone through elections, but they are not democratically elected. Because election is not what makes them democratically elected. The will of the people is what makes them democratically elected. And you cannot agree that the leaders do not arise as a result of, you can't talk about free and free elections and then talk about democratically elected leader. It's not possible. If the elections are not free and fair, the person who comes out of them cannot be democratically elected. It is not possible. So, and probably 90% of African leaders have been elected,
but not democratic. So they stole elections.
Yes, yeah, they're not democratic.
Because that's the yardstick for democracy. They took power.
Yeah. So now, it means that for those 90% of the leaders, the military should have the right to remove them because they are not democratically elected, and the military is there to secure the will of the people, right?
No, it's not the military which has the right to secure the rule of the people.
All institutions, including the military.
Yeah.
All institutions,
But
the military is
aside.
the strongest. Is the strongest.
Yeah, let him finish his
But the
point.
military
Yes,
works for
let
the
him finish,
people.
let him
Yes,
finish.
yes. Military works for the people.
Yes.
That's why I'm telling you.
Yeah.
What you need are two things. In fact, actually, let me establish the relations between this idea that civilians are more enlightened than military people is false. It is just propaganda. There's no merit. There is no merit to the idea that the civilians are more enlightened than military people.
Yeah.
None whatsoever.
But
So
my thesis was on civil military relations.
hold up.
My
Yes.
thesis was
I'm
on
going to
civil military
establish-
relations. Because you are going to lie to us.
I'm going to establish.
Me, I wrote on civil military relations
Yes.
how military should work with the civilians.
Yes.
The civilian has a supremacy over military. But they work together.
I'm going to explain you why.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll explain to you why they have it. So this is why you stop reading Paul Collier. I need to read more of my stuff.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Dr.
so-
No problem.
Yeah.
The military the military is under civilian authority. Why? It's the idea that the military might abuse its power, the monopoly of violence, and establish itself in leadership.
Yeah.
Underline the word abuse. Now, the civilian who has abused authority can be replaced by, or the military has something to do with the civilian who has abused authority. So the idea that the military is subordinate to the civilian only works if there is a civilian who operates and serves in the aspirations of the people. If this civilian is not operating in the interest of the people, aspiration of the people, this person has lost the legitimacy to be subordinate, to have the military subordinate to this person. Yeah. So the moment the leader, and this is what is happening in West Africa, the moment the leader is destructive, in this case West Africa, is running the country and national resources are being used in the interest of foreign powers, that at that moment the civilian has lost the authority that requires the military to be subordinate to them. Therefore, the rise of the military over the civilian is entirely legitimate. So we should not talk about theory. We should talk about the objective to which theory serves. And this is the relationship. The relationship is not a Bible. The relationship is not written somewhere in stone. It's written in the substance of the operations of the state. And this is the idea that the moment the civilian authority is not responsive to the people, they are no longer, the military is no longer subordinate to them.
Yeah, so and then they take over.
Yes.
And
But before the military
in fact,
behaves,
not even the military, anyone else with the authority and the power to do so
Can take
should
over.
do so.
Okay.
It only happens to be the military because, one, it's the most organized, two, it has the resources to do
monopoly
so.
of violence.
Now, what do you need? You need two things. You need responsive, conscientious leadership.
Yeah.
You need a responsive, conscientious military.
Yeah.
The moment this one fails, you remove. Military removes. The moment the military fails...
And then we'll have anarchism.
Okay.
If that happens, there will be anarchism, there will be no state,
hold up.
there will be state failure, there will be
Because
no
we're
government.
already in anarchy if you have
No,
a
we need
leadership.
to have democratic government, not anarchism.
Okay, hold up. Thank you
Being
so much.
civilian does not make someone democratic.
We will come back for this.
Yeah, it is
I'm
the
sure we'll
substance of
definitely-
the action.
He is completely offside.
Yeah, I know.
That will be anarchism. Then we're taking
the
us back to the
and the
ages.
referee here waves play on, and I'm going to bring in Dr. Sarah. We need to start wrapping up. I'm told that we have about just 5 minutes to go. But I don't want us to end this conversation without actually bringing in the role of the place of continental binding principles, like the Lome Declaration. We have the African Union and other regional economic communities. We even had a rule that any leader who takes over through means of coup, that country is suspended, or you know, there's a way in terms of the stick coming in to avoid the encouragement of coups within the continent. How have these institutions performed, like the African Union? Because we have seen some of those leaders who took over through means of coup, but they are welcome, you know, they still mingle with the rest of the African leaders. But also we've seen some leaders from Africa who have outrightly condemned these coups only for them to have an egg on the face because they have to sit next to each other at the African Union during an African Union summit. Talk to me a bit about how these institutions and these principles have fared on this conversation of coups, just in a short while, because we need to start wrapping up.
Thank you very much. You know, the spirit of the African Union Constitutive Act and the AU Agenda 2063 was in that line of outlawing coups. But what happens is that the African Union does not respect its own laws and constitutions. Let's take an example of the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections and Good Governance.
Yeah.
It is an attempt to clearly define what a credible, free and fair election should be and what is expected of the member states. You can also look at the Charter of Human and People's Rights.
Yeah.
Do they respect them? Do they implement them? So Africa has largely remained a talking shop, or you can call it a tea party for presidents to go and cheer each other. I do not really think that the current composition and conduct of African Union aims at creating a serious architecture to propel Africa to the next level of development. They do not have what it takes. It's merely a talking shop.
All right.
And they contradict themselves even by their own conduct.
Got you, Dr. Sarah. I need us to bring in Dr. Emmanuel in your thoughts on this, because we have just under 30 seconds. Maybe what would you say about this, just in closing? Where do we move from here? Because this conversation will not end here tonight.
The African Union should take itself seriously. Let us stick to the Lome Declaration of the year 2000, which was quite an important document in making sure that illegitimate seizures of power, if that is where we are going, should not be allowed. Secondly, let us also take seriously, especially at the African Union level, Article 4H from the OAU, which was state-centric, and it talked about non-interference in the affairs of other states. But then with the introduction of with the transformation of the OAU to the African Union, we are now talking about the principle of non-indifference. So if we could make sure that we checkmate our peers in Africa, then I think we will see a reduction in unconstitutional seizures of power.
Right. Thank you so much. I'll come back to Lons and Dr. Abineza, but let me quickly read comments on social media. Mojase Francisca says, please remind Honorable Frank that military are also citizens and they suffer the same consequences of poor governance. So given their position in national structures, they can intervene to central and internal matter. Thank you so much for that comment right there. Of course, also on our YouTube channel, I've got several of them. I have Felix, who says leaders in Africa, majority of them are not making their citizens more satisfactory as a way military intervenes in order to generate their assistance. Kitenge says the leaders in Africa are being removed by coup because they don't serve the interest of the people. As you can, it's true to some African countries. My question to you, was Gaddafi not served? Did he serve the interest of Africa? I think that's a very interesting one. Africa, stand up and unite. Otherwise, this is Mohozi Jonan right there on there. Omolo, My Fitness says, my conclusion, we don't need democracy. Instead, we need meritocracy. This is what he says. In under a minute, what would you say?
You know, these
under a minute, Doctor.
These Western powers, the hypocrisy they have. When the coup is sponsored by them, they don't condemn and they don't put sanctions. But when the coup revolutionary, they condemn and they place sanctions. What we need is what? We need a conscientious military, and we need to encourage it to do more coups.
Right. Okay. Yes. And that is your point. How about you?
I think Dr. Reza needs to go back to school now. Because it looks like once anarchism back in the world. But anyway, I would say that it's completely wrong for military to remove elected governments. The elected institutions who have the parliament, who have the judiciary, should take up their responsibilities to check any leader who's doing something wrong, who is not doing right. Secondly, the African Union, with its regional economic blocs, they should really have a strong military capacity, the standby brigades, as they call them, that can immediately intervene in such cases take place and remove that coup d'etat, that coup or junta, those juntas, remove them. So
That's propaganda.
And reinstall a democratically elected government. So in this case, the ECOWAS should do their job. They shouldn't be scared by the threats of Burkina Faso and Mali. They should just go, the ECOWAS should just go and remove that junta.
We have civilian juntas.
In what? In Niger.
Don't overthrow me.
Install
Don't
the president.
What are you going to do? The
All right,
civilian
thank you,
juntas,
thank
what
you.
are you going to do with
All
them?
right, like I was
What are you going to do with the civilian juntas?
This
You know,
conversation never ends.
no anarchism, we need democracy in
All right,
Africa.
no anarchy on my side. Thank you very much. Of course, this conversation will not end here tonight, like you can see. It has to continue on social media platforms. Keep tweeting. The hashtag, as always, is the Summit RW. We'll keep talking. Of course, there's a coup I need to work on here. Dr. Lonzen wants to take over the Green Party.
I already did. I'm the president of the Green
Thank you
Party.
so much.
you have to wait.
He's the former president of the
Let me
Green
handle
Party.
You have to wait.
this. Right here in studio.
Yeah.
Bye-bye for now.
He overstayed. He overstayed. He overstayed in power.
But then when are you leaving?
Yeah.
When are you leaving office?
I'm still.
You're still-
He overstayed. Yes.
RBA app is here. How to get it? It is easier